And yet for this fellow putting up a QR code directing people to a film that I think serves as a cautionary tale, they want to throw him in the slammer.
We're removing all the titty we can. Then we're going to staple the flap back down onto your stomach. You'll have a giant smiley face across your chest for the rest of your life. But goodbye B-cup. Hello manhood. Now sure, the procedure's not exactly perfect.
We believe this is the first of its kind on this type of alleged hate crime.
Well, folks, another victory against wokeism, censorship, and transanity thanks to the efforts of the Democracy Fund. Here's the skinny. A young man who faced criminal charges for inciting hatred against transgenders was acquitted. Now, hatred against any group, that's beyond the pale, of course. So what, pray tell, did this 18-year-old man in Waterloo Region do against transgenders? Well, here's where the story gets downright unbelievable. This student had placed posters around his Catholic school that contained a QR code. The QR code linked to a video warning transgender individuals about the risks of gender reassignment surgery. And yet this was deemed to be transphobic hate speech. Well, at least it was in the eyes of one school official who called the cops. Unbelievable. But thankfully, after a 2-day trial, sanity prevailed in the courtroom and the young man was acquitted. And joining me now with all the details is Mark Joseph of the Democracy Fund. You know, Mark, I find this to be a fascinating case. Let's go back to the very genesis of how this thing became a thing. What was the motivation of a Catholic school official to bring law enforcement into this in the first place?
Well, that's a good question, and we can't speculate as to the motives behind the school official who reported the student, but clearly they felt that something in the film, which apparently they only reviewed in a cursory manner, was hateful. And then the police ended up charging our client with a hate crime, essentially Section 319 sub 1, which is the incitement to hatred of a identifiable group that would likely lead to breach of the peace. So there's two important elements here. That's the incitement to hatred and then likely to lead to a breach of peace. And then the Crown took that forward to trial.
Unbelievable. But, you know, Mark, the way I look at things is that far from an act of hatred, this was actually an act of kindness. And by that, I mean this student was saying to those who are considering very serious operations, whether it's a woman having her breasts amputated or another individual having their, genitals sliced and diced. This is very consequential surgery. We know that many of the people in that community that go through this thinking it's going to be a utopia for what they're going through right now, they end up having buyer's remorse. And he was simply saying, hey, this is what you need to know. How is that interpreted as an act of hate against transgenders or those who are looking at transgender surgery?
I mean, that's a question, I suppose, for the Crown. The judge clearly disagreed that it was an incitement to hatred. The client was motivated by his Christian beliefs. So in that sense, yes, it was an act of Christian kindness. I assume that's was his position. And I want to make clear that the film didn't advocate for violence in any form.
Exactly.
So it just took a different position on transgender theory. So it was hard to see that this would fall under the rubric of hate speech. And remember, the Supreme Court of Canada in a case called Watcott said there has to be indicia of hate, and that's things like claiming the group was parasitic, was criminal, menace to society, those things. And so that's a high bar to establish in our law, and the judge obviously found that bar wasn't surmounted.
Thank goodness. And Mark, in the Department of Don't Tell Me, Show Me, folks, here's an excerpt from that film. You tell me, does this look like hate speech against any identifiable group to you?
He wants a summer home. You believe that? telling her, Karen, we can't afford it. You know how many of these surgeries I'd have to do to buy a summer home? She wants to live in the Hamptons. Ted, hold that down. Thank you. A little tighter. Still have that Chihuahua? He likes dog treats, doesn't he? This guy's not going to need them anymore.
Keep going, keep going.
All right, I'm inverting the penis now. Does somebody want to turn my operating music on? Ted, can you hit the... Oh, thank you, nurse. We're just going to saw those bad boys right out of there. Now, this beautiful little procedure, it's completely safe. We sedate you, stick you onto a table, and then we hack your tits off with a saw. We get right up in there.
There might have been a problem with postering here. Like the student might have breached a policy on postering, but to suggest that just linking to a film that might contain things that some people would say are offensive doesn't rise to the level of a hate crime. So that was unusual, and that's obviously why TDF stepped in and partnered with Alan Honor, the lawyer on this file, who did a magnificent job in defending the client. We're pulling the transcript now. The judge, she said that she would publish the decision, or she would look at doing that. So we're hoping to get the full reasons, and we'll update our website and our X feed when we do, but my understanding was that the judge didn't believe that the film rose to the comments in the film rose to the level of hate, and she didn't find that it would likely lead to a breach of the peace. So the Crown needs to establish those things beyond a reasonable doubt, and obviously the Crown couldn't in the view of the court. But we're going to be taking a look at the actual reasons, and we'll publish those when they come out.
I applaud that, Judge Mark. I mean, this is, to me, an example of common sense as opposed to going the woke route, which unfortunately I see far too often in courts these days. But let's talk about, if the Democracy Fund wasn't involved and didn't pull off this victory, if this young man, only 18 years old, if he or his family had to hire a lawyer and defend this serious criminal charge, ballpark, what are we talking about in terms of what the financial cost would be?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say. I don't do criminal law exclusively, but lawyers are expensive. So I would have to say 5 figures, maybe 20,000 or more, to get a lawyer involved, because this is a lot of work, right? You have to liaise with your client. You've got to advise them after reviewing the Crown's case. You've got to review their disclosure. You've got to go back and forth with the Crown, JPTs and CPTs, and then you've got to go to trial. This is a 2-day trial and then a 1-day judgment. So it was a lot of judicial resources expended on what we think was an overcharge here. It shouldn't have gone this far. The client was also charged with mischief and trespass, and so those charges also were not made out. So it wasn't just a hate crime, which is bad enough, because that's terrifying for someone to be facing 2 years potentially jail, and the Crown was seeking jail in this case. So,
jail? Right,
that's right. Jail and probation. So this was a serious matter, and for a young man, having a life-altering event, and the Crown wanted to take it to trial, so luckily our donors stepped in. We were able to have Alan successfully defend.
I've known of a case of someone up on attempted murder that got bail, and yet for this fellow putting up a QR code directing people to a film that I think serves as a cautionary tale, they want to throw him in the slammer. I mean, do we have our priorities straight in Canada right now, that you can get a pass on violent crime, but if you create or you're convicted of a thought crime, well, they'll throw the book at you?
Well, look, that's a question for the Crown, the Crown's office, the Attorney General. But as a citizen, I'd want to see the Crown prioritize the most serious offenses for prosecution, because you want to get the serious criminals off the street. So going after this type of offense, and as I say, seemingly overcharging something for this type of conduct, is an odd choice. But that's a public policy question, I think, that maybe the Crown will answer.
I can take you to intersections of Toronto every single weekend where the pro-Hamas people are openly calling for the genocide of the Jewish people. Jews go back to Europe from the river to the sea, and far worse things than that. Dressing up as Sinwar, the terrorist mastermind, displaying swastikas. And law enforcement, they turn a blind eye. Actually, that's not true. Law enforcement will arrest peaceful counter demonstrators and even members of the independent media. And yet this 18-year-old, for just basically, publishing a QR code leading people to a video that does not, by the judge's own words, incite hatred, gets charged. Why are we even here in this situation in the first place?
Well, I can't say why the police choose to charge who they charge, but one of the many problems with these hate speech laws is that their application and their interpretation is inherently political. So some people get charged and some people don't, and then the public is left to speculate as to why that is. Yeah. And as you bring up, some in the Jewish community might say, how come this person get charged? And right. How come this other person get charged? The Palestinian community might ask the same question. So that's politically problematic. And then the government's going to see, whatever they do, the government's going to be accused, the prosecution is going to be accused, a bias. And it's tough to argue against that. I mean, maybe they're not biased, but there's going to be an appearance of bias in the application of these hate speech charges. And I want to make another comment. A lot of those problems that you indicate are already covered by our laws. We have mischief. As you know, people get charged with mischief if they block streets, or criminal harassment if they follow people and hurl insults constantly. Assault, we have assault provisions. So that the laws are already there to protect people from this type of conduct. But again, police, Crown, for whatever reason, are choosing not to charge those types of people. And then that raises the problem, as I said, of bias, potential appearance of bias, and we don't want to have that. Undermines the administration of justice.
No, you're so right. I know in Section 319 of the Criminal Code, there is law that specifically addresses calling for harm or death to an identifiable group, and yet over and over and over again, the police and the politicians, I think, turn a blind eye and a deaf ear, and I think it's politically motivated, but that's a story for another time. What has the client said? Because I know we're not identifying him, but has this been a great sense of relief, a feeling that justice has been done?
Well, I mean, I know it's always a relief when a client is vindicated at trial, but it's just exhausting and psychologically punishing to go through this process. Because, man, this thing doesn't get resolved in 2 or 3 months. It can go on for a year or more. So I know the client is grateful, and of course, we want to thank our donors, because it's only their donations that make it possible for TDF and Alan Hunter to do their work. So we want to thank our donors, of course.
And Mark, where can our viewers donate to the Democracy Fund if they choose so? Well,
we're a charity and we don't accept government donations. So if people like our work and they want to see us continue to do this type of work, they can go to TDF_can on X or thedemocracyfund.ca.
Folks, if you headed up to here with Transanity, you know that intersection where radical transgenderism meets insanity. We sure have. Please go to our petition, transmadness.com. That's transmadness.com. Put your name to that petition, and if you're able to, kindly make a donation so that Rebel News can continue to bring you the other side of the story.